The air inside Studio 6B at 30 Rockefeller Plaza usually felt like a pressurized cabin, humming with the artificial energy of a late-night institution. But tonight, as the red tally lights on the cameras flickered to life, the atmosphere was different. It was heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and floor wax, and a silence that didn't belong in a comedy house. Jimmy Fallon sat behind his desk, his suit perfectly tailored, his hands resting flat on the mahogany surface. He looked like the picture of stability, a beacon of late-night comfort. Opposite him sat Senator Mitch McConnell. The senator was a man who had spent decades turning silence into a weapon, a politician who understood that in Washington, the man who speaks last usually wins. He looked comfortable, his hands folded over his knee, a slight practiced smile touching his lips. It was the smile of a man who believed he was in total control of the room. Jimmy began with the usual grace, welcoming the senator back to the show, making small talk about the history of the building and the longevity of the senator's career. The audience gave the polite, rhythmic applause expected of them, but there was an underlying tremor of anticipation. Everyone knew this wasn't a standard promotional stop. Jimmy's voice was steady, a calm baritone that betrayed nothing of the storm he was about to unleash. He spoke of the senator's reputation as the master of the Senate, the man who could move mountains with a single phone call. McConnell nodded, accepting the praise as his due, his eyes behind his glasses unblinking. Then, the pivot happened. It wasn't a sudden jerk, but a smooth, inevitable slide into deeper waters. Jimmy reached under his desk and pulled out a thin, slate-gray folder. He didn't slam it down. He placed it between them with the care of a priest handling a relic. He mentioned a name that hadn't been heard in public circles for years: the Chesapeake Protocol. The senator's smile didn't vanish, but it froze. It became a mask, a porcelain facsimile of friendliness that no longer reached his eyes. Jimmy began to read from the top sheet of the folder. He spoke of a series of private meetings held in a windowless room in Annapolis, meetings that were never logged on any official calendar. He spoke of a quiet agreement regarding the deregulation of coal ash disposal in exchange for the fast-tracking of 3 specific judicial appointments. The senator's response was a masterclass in deflection. He spoke of the complexity of the legislative process, the need for compromise in a divided government, and the way the public often misunderstood the mechanics of power. But Jimmy wasn't asking for a lesson in civics. He flipped to the second page. He began to cite specific dates and specific dollar amounts. He mentioned a shell company based out of Dover, Delaware, a company that existed for only 90 days, exactly long enough to facilitate a transfer that coincided with a crucial vote on the Senate floor. The audience had stopped laughing. The only sound in the cavernous studio was the low hum of the air conditioning and the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Jimmy remained composed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward in an aggressive posture. He simply stayed in the light, his expression one of calm, almost empathetic curiosity. He was the investigator, who already knew the answer, the host who was giving his guest every opportunity to find a way out that didn't exist. He asked the senator if he remembered a phone call on the evening of October 14th. McConnell paused. It was the famous McConnell pause, the long, calculated silence that usually forced opponents to fill the air with nervous chatter. But tonight, Jimmy didn't fill the air. He waited. He let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, then unbearable. He let the silence become a mirror, reflecting the growing realization on the senator's face that the room was no longer safe. When the senator finally spoke, his voice was thinner, a raspy shadow of its former authority. He claimed he didn't recall the specific details of a call from years ago. Jimmy nodded, as if he expected that answer. He then reached for a small remote on his desk. On the large monitors flanking the stage, a waveform appeared. It was a recording, cleaned of its static, crystal clear. It was the senator's voice, unmistakable in its cadence. In the recording, the senator wasn't talking about compromise or the good of the country. He was talking about leverage. He was talking about burying the report so the deal could breathe. The words hung in the air of the studio like a physical weight. The camera pulled in tight on McConnell's face. In the high-definition glare of the studio lights, every line of tension was visible. The senator's eyes darted toward the exit, then back to Jimmy. He was looking for the trapdoor, the commercial break, the producer's signal that would end the nightmare. But the red light stayed on. Jimmy didn't move. He asked a single question. "Senator, if the public record says one thing and this recording says another, which one should we believe?" It was the killing blow. There was no legislative maneuver to counter a direct confrontation with one's own voice. The senator attempted to speak, his mouth moving before the words were ready. He talked about context, about the dangers of illegal surveillance, about the way politics required difficult choices, but his hands were shaking. He tried to hide them by gripping the arms of his chair, but the tremor was visible in the way his shoulders hunched. He looked older, suddenly, as if the weight of the secrets he had carried for 40 years had finally settled on his chest all at once. The master of the Senate was gone. In his place was a man who realized that his legacy was being dismantled in real time, in front of millions of people, on a stage built for jokes and songs. Jimmy Fallon leaned back slightly, his expression shifting from curiosity to a solemn, quiet observation. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't celebrating. He was simply watching the inevitable collapse of a structure that had been built on a foundation of hidden truths. He mentioned the final document in the folder, a signed affidavit from a former staffer who had finally decided that the burden of the Chesapeake Protocol was too much to bear. The senator didn't even try to respond to that. He just stared at the folder, his eyes fixed on the gray cardboard, as if he could make it disappear by sheer force of will. The audience was frozen. This wasn't the show they had signed up for. They were witnessing a historical autopsy, a surgical removal of a political persona. The silence in the room was now absolute. Even the cameramen seemed to hold their breath. Jimmy looked directly into the lens of camera one, then back to the senator. He didn't need to say another word. The contradiction was complete. The evidence was undeniable. The senator's career, built on the mastery of the shadows, was ending in the brightest light imaginable. As the segment drew to a close, there were no upbeat musical cues from the band. There was no comedic relief. Jimmy thanked the senator for his time, his voice remaining level and professional. He didn't shake the senator's hand. He simply stood up as the lights began to dim, leaving McConnell sitting in the chair, a solitary figure surrounded by the remnants of a shattered narrative. The senator didn't move. He remained in the chair, his gaze fixed on the floor, the silent panic finally reaching its peak. He was a man who had always known how to play the game, but he had finally encountered a move he couldn't counter. The game was over, and the silence that remained was the only thing he had left. The walk from the desk to the wings of the stage usually took Jimmy 5 seconds. Tonight, it felt like an eternity. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing against his back. He didn't look back at the desk. He didn't look at the audience. He knew that what had just happened would ripple through the halls of power for decades. It was the moment the music stopped, the moment the theater of the Senate was replaced by the reality of the record. Behind him, the senator still sat, a monument to a vanishing era, realizing that the one thing he could never legislate away was the truth. The lights in the studio finally faded to black, but the image of the frozen senator remained burned into the retinas of everyone who had seen it. It was the final chapter of a long book, a chapter that had been written in the silence between the words. Jimmy Fallon had stayed calm. The truth had not, and in the end, that was all that mattered. The power had shifted, not through a vote or a decree, but through the simple, devastating act of holding up a mirror to a man who had spent his life avoiding his own reflection. The Chesapeake Protocol was no longer a secret. The senator was no longer the master of the room, and the silence, once his greatest ally, had finally become his judge. Outside, the city of New York continued its frantic pace, unaware that inside a small studio in Midtown, a tectonic shift had occurred. The news would break within minutes. The phones in the Capitol would start ringing, and they wouldn't stop for days. The senator would eventually be led out of the building, shielded by aides and security. But the man who walked out wouldn't be the same man who had walked in. The armor had been pierced. The legend had been dismantled. And as the credits rolled in silence, the world realized that some secrets are too heavy to carry into the light. Jimmy sat in his dressing room, the folder still in his hand. He looked at the signature on the affidavit, the ink dark and permanent. He knew the cost of what had just happened. He knew the risks. But as he closed the folder and placed it on his table, he felt a sense of clarity. The show was over, but the story was just beginning. In the world of high-stakes politics, there is no such thing as a clean exit. There is only the moment the truth becomes louder than the lies. And tonight, that moment had been captured for everyone to see. The senator had finally run out of pauses. The truth had finally run out of patience. And the room, once a place of laughter, had become a chamber of reckoning. The final image on the monitors, before they were powered down for the night, was the empty chair on the stage. It sat under a single spotlight, a stark reminder of the power that had once occupied it and the void that was now left behind. The silence of the studio was no longer heavy. It was empty. The senator was gone, the protocol was exposed, and the narrative of Washington, D.C. had been changed forever. Not by a politician, but by a man who knew how to ask the right question at the exactly wrong time. The echoes of the recording still seemed to vibrate in the air, a haunting melody of accountability that would follow the senator into the night and beyond. There was no going back. There was no undoing what had been done. The silence was over, the truth was out, and the world was watching. As the crew began to strike the set, moving the chairs and clearing the desk, they worked in a hushed, reverent tone. They knew they had been part of something that transcended television. They had seen the collapse of a titan, the unraveling of a legacy, and the birth of a new era of transparency. It was a night that would be studied, analyzed, and remembered as the moment the curtains were pulled back on the most guarded secrets of the Republic. And at the center of it all was a folder, a recording, and a man who had finally found himself in a room where his silence didn't mean anything at all. The master of the Senate had been mastered by the facts, and the result was a stillness that spoke louder than any speech he had ever given. The night was over, but the reverberations were just beginning to be felt, stretching out from Rockefeller Plaza to the furthest corners of the country, carrying the message that no matter how high you climb, the ground is always waiting. The senator's car pulled away from the curb, disappearing into the neon blur of the city. Inside, he sat in the dark, watching the lights of New York flicker past his window. He didn't speak to his driver. He didn't check his phone. He just watched the world go by, a world that now knew exactly who he was and what he had done. The Chesapeake Protocol was no longer his burden alone. It belonged to history, and history, he knew, was a far less forgiving host than Jimmy Fallon. The silence in the car was the same silence that had filled the studio, a cold, hollow space where his power used to be. It was the silence of the end, and as the car merged onto the highway, heading south toward the Capitol, the senator realized that for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. The narrative had reached its conclusion, the trap had snapped shut, and the man who had always controlled the clock had finally run out of time.